You're listening to Leadership Recalibrated, where we dismantle outdated leadership playbooks and explore the new way to lead. I'm Lori Lalonde, founder of Her Executive Ascent, and I created this podcast because I was tired of hearing the same recycled advice about what it takes to be a good leader. You know the scripts: be more confident, lean in, develop executive presence. But what if those scripts were written for a leadership model that no longer works? What if the future of leadership looks less like commanding authority and more like strategic influence, emotional intelligence, and authentic power? Each week, we take on the questions most leadership programs avoid, the power dynamics nobody teaches, and the decisions that actually shape your career. This is where you stop following the old rules and start designing the leadership career that fits who you are now and where you're going next. Let's recalibrate. What if the secret to scaling your impact, your career, and your influence wasn't about working harder or knowing more, but about who you bring into the room with you? Today's guest has spent 25 years doing exactly that. From her early days as a CPA at PwC to executive and C suite roles across some of North America's most ambitious growth stage technology companies, she has built a career defined not just by financial acumen, but by something far less talked about in the boardroom: the power of radical generosity. Saeideh Fard, who goes by Saei, currently serves as CFO at Introhive, a B2B SaaS company delivering client intelligence, data, and automation solutions to top legal, accounting, and consulting firms across North America and Europe. Before that, she held senior finance leadership roles at Point Click Care, Tulip Retail, and Kensington Tours, spanning high organic growth and M&A environments across multiple markets. But what makes this conversation different from your typical finance and leadership discussion is that Sai is going to share something that rarely gets talked about at the executive level: a concept she calls the power of three, a framework rooted in network brand and the kind of intentional generosity that creates a multiplier effect most leaders never tap into. She is also deeply committed to helping women, youth, and immigrants find their footing and their voice in the professional world. And that commitment shows up in everything she shares today. This is a conversation about influence, visibility, and what it really takes to build a career and a network that works for you, even when you think you don't have the time. Let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast today, Sai. I'm so excited that you're here with us today. Before we get started, I know all about you and your backstory. I've been fortunate enough to be connected with you through a shared network connection. I'd love to hear from your perspective a little bit about what you've been working on recently, your backstory, and then we'll get into it.
Thanks so much, Lori, for the opportunity to connect on these great topics that we've been chatting about throughout the last year. For the audience, my name is Sai, or I go by Sai. And in terms of a background, I started my career in finance within one of the big four, PwC. I've spent the majority of my career working in what we call high tech, or within enterprise SaaS. And I would say over the last 10 years, my career spans about 25 years, but the last 10 to 12 years of it has been spent in executive roles. And most of those roles have spanned working in technology with folks that are bringing transformation lenses to the work that we all do. I would say a lot of the success that I've experienced earlier on in my career can be attributed to much of what we're going to talk about today. And it comes down to the power of both brand and network, and bringing those two things together in what I would call the power of three as one of the examples of how that shows up. And I'm excited to talk about that today.
So you mentioned the power of brand and network as two things, but you called it the power of three. So, what is the third element and why does that change everything?
The way that I would define this concept, and I think it's good to define it first before we get deeper into the questions. There's this concept of solving problems outside of just one unit ourselves, and it's extending that problem solving capability to, or handing the problem to at least three folks in our network who become support for us. That extension of the network, when we're solving problems that often we put on ourselves, the weight that we put on ourselves, often amplifies the reach of each of the individuals that are working on the problem itself. It also is a much bigger solution than just even the sum of the parts, right? So you think about four people getting together. So power of three, 3 plus 1. There is a lot more that comes into effect than just four people putting their brains together when you have the ability to tap into the amplified networks that each of those individuals brings. So there's a multiplication effect that is at play here that is super powerful. So that's how I would define it. But maybe we get into some of the deeper either questions or examples that I'm happy to give.
Yeah, for sure. Before we get into it, I definitely want to connect that because that is how you came into my life.
Yes,
So,
that's true. That is very true.
yes. So a shared network connection. My good friend and previous colleague, Reka, who's also been on my podcast, connected us as I was building out my leadership program because there was this module on financial acumen that I was absolutely dreading because I know nothing about financial acumen from a CFO perspective, but I wanted to create content that would resonate with leaders that are getting into a role where they have to manage a budget. And you were connected with me through Reka. And then you helped me to really position and define and craft an interesting module that would resonate with my target audience. And that connection was so powerful because you were so wonderful in leveraging your knowledge and experience and generous with your time to help lend your expertise to that and then make it in such a way that it was easily digestible for people like me who cringe at the term financial acumen. But that was so powerful, and we've been connected ever since. You've been such an amazing advocate and champion for me, but that amplification of Reka's network, connecting me with you, you supporting me, you also in turn opening up your, network by giving me visibility, in LinkedIn when you comment and on my posts and when you share them. That's one example. And for me, I lived it, so that's why I think I'm so excited when we were talking about this. I was like, "Yes, this is so much better than talking about financial acumen on the podcast," which originally I thought might have been a good approach, but I love this. And so it's really about expanding our influence and reach and helping people in ways that they least expected it, but have the greatest impact.
Yeah, and there's one more part to it too. And that part, which we don't often talk about, is our stress response when people reach out to us and they ask for help. That stress response, I've come to realize, lives in every single one of us, right? So if we're busy, which most of us are these days, especially for executives or even just people leaders, that stress response is real. And it's that initial knee jerk, oh, I don't have time to, or I don't have the resources, or I don't have the answer to what somebody's looking for. There's also a little bit of imposter syndrome whenever anybody reaches out and asks for help, because deep down we worry about the concern that we're going to potentially let somebody down if we don't have an immediate answer or a good enough answer. And that's real. I think that lives in every single one of us. It's a reason a lot of people don't help. And it's probably the anticipated response when somebody doesn't ask for help. And so I think when we think about this power of three, we have to unpack first that stress response, right? When somebody comes to us and there is only one of us to solve the problem that they're putting in front of us that they want help with, it can feel daunting. Often we don't have the answer. And so we get debilitated. Sometimes we don't even respond. Other times we respond and we say, "Oh, I don't have time." But for me, I think one thing that's been a super game changer in my career has been to be okay with that discomfort and to understand that I don't have to solve that problem immediately through myself. I can bring a network to it. And even that network, if they can't immediately have a solution for what is being sought, the classic example is people reach out when they're looking for a job, right? And the reason a lot of us don't reach back out is because we don't have a job immediately in front of us to solve that problem. But it doesn't mean that we don't have a network that can help provide advice, provide mentorship, provide a bigger network. And so I've come to think about outreaches in that sort of a way where I always say to myself, if I have three people who can be of value to this problem, I'm going to deploy that power of three. They are going to become closer contacts as a result of being in this swarm team with me. I'm going to keep in better contact with them. And so our own relationship also deepens as a result of me extending help to somebody that has reached out. And I think we often overlook that virtuous cycle of helping others through your network actually makes you a more sticky or a more fresh contact to some of the folks that you'd love to keep in touch with, but you don't really have a way of working with day to day. And so there is this virtuous cycle of support that develops when you're seen as the person who is the helper. And others want to be helpers, right? Like, but often it takes that warm connection for them to be brought into a team. And then often, if you just want to take it one step further, other connection becomes somebody that, you know, the three folks that are in the network, at least one of them takes an interest. And that becomes a shared contact. That becomes a shared relationship. And that's how you maintain deeper ties to a much bigger group of people, because you don't have projects that you take on day to day with others. But how great does it feel to have your favorite people that you've worked with in the past be brought closer to a problem that you're all trying to solve together in service of somebody else? That feels really great, actually. And there is a confidence effect that builds from that. And we can go into that as well.
Yes. I love that. I'm going to pull out that last piece. When thinking about the power of three, for a woman who feels her calendar is already at capacity, why is this a strategic investment that she can do rather than just an item on her to do list?
So that's a really good question. I'm actually asked that question a lot. How do you find time? Because I'm a mom of two, not young, but young enough kids. I have a lot going on at work, and I also have board duties outside of work that take up time. Why do I do it? And why do I think it's of value? I think we have a tendency. So when we're solving problems, let's say at work, in our regular settings as executives or leaders on the rise, or folks who want to be on the rise, there's a tendency for us to zero in on the problem that is in front of us. So the things that keep us up at night at certain stages of our career are very limited, but they feel really potent. They keep us up at night because they feel bigger than anyone looking in might realize. For me, I have realized that the most important thing for having good mental health, and I define mental health as also just having the ability to be creative with problem solving. The most important thing is context and perspective for me. And so when the problem sitting in front of me is just one or two things, they tend to feel much more amped up, and I lose perspective and I lose creativity in how to solve those problems. But when I do get perspective, which is, okay, there's all these other problems that others are trying to solve in the world, and there's different ways to create value for the world, I stop defining myself just by whatever's frustrating me that's sitting right in front of me. And I think that can actually be a really great leadership quality, right? The ability to be able to spot noise, the ability to self-regulate and to bring perspective into problems that may feel for teams at work like they're the only thing that's going on in a moment. And so that's one reason. I love having perspective. The second one is just, I think, from a confidence effect. When we have the abilities to have servant leadership outside of just what's immediately in front of us, there is a confidence effect that builds because we start to define ourselves from a success perspective differently than just, what is the job that is immediately in front of me. And that, interestingly, can actually have very important leadership payoffs in the role because we can contextualize, we can get out of our own heads, we can deal with our own egos, and it can help us be a little bit more open and scan more for the types of things that are much more human in settings where many of us are working remote, right? And so that type of perspective, I think, has been really good for me in framing what's in front of me as just one of the many ways that I can bring value into the world. And it's helped me avoid over fixating on themes that are out of my control. It's helped me define noise differently at work, and it's helped me show up as much more human and authentic.
I love that. I can see parallels here. You're not a leader just at work. It's not a title, it's something you embody. You embody a leadership behavior. And that shows up when you are lending yourself to external support for people that you may be connecting with or people are reaching out to you for?
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
kind of what it looks like?
Yeah.
I would love to hear from your perspective, maybe if there's a story that you can share around how you introduced that to someone. I mean, we already talked about my story, so maybe another story.
Yeah.
How you introduced that to someone and how that caused a ripple effect for them.
In their career, right? Okay. So there's a couple of examples that come to mind. One of them is actually it's an interesting one. It's two individuals, one of which I hadn't gotten to know super well in a last work setting, which it was a very large environment in terms of number of employees. But I had spoken on a number of panels while I was at that last workplace. And so there was a common connection. So speaking of these power of three. So there was another VP who had introduced this individual to me just as I was leaving. And so there was enough that we had in common that we had stayed in touch on LinkedIn. And there was a layoff that happened within, I would say, 6 months of me leaving this workplace. And 6 months after that layoff, this individual reached out. She was underemployed. She was doing contract work, and asked me if I would be able to put her in touch with my network. And going back to that stress response, there was a stress response because I remember thinking, wow, this individual is far more qualified than I would ever be in this very technical field. It was a health field. That's not my background whatsoever. And also, I had to overcome that sense of, well, I'm kind of useless for this problem. Which is the stress response saying, I don't know why I'm being reached out to. I have no ability to help. Then I thought, okay, let's go back to the toolkit, right? And so I don't have the ability to bring any deep health network, whether it's jobs or, in C-level that can go and chase this, right? So I don't have that ability to do that. But we usually only sit 2 or 3 steps away from a solved problem. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go through my network and scan who would be slightly better than me at being able to provide the next set of steps, not necessarily a job, but the next set of steps. And so I put in touch. This individual was, again, somebody else that I had kept in touch with online. I have many groups that kind of intersect. I have a lot of different types of social justice interests, as you know. And so I put this individual with somebody else in my network who had reached out on a post that I'd written on LinkedIn. And we had 3 or 4 conversations, meaningful, authentic, bonding, but we'd never met, and 2 other folks. And so within about a month, they did exactly as I did. They overcame the discomfort of, not having an immediate answer. They went for a coffee, they connected. And it was 2 women who then came back to me and said, we would never have met had you, not thought about taking a member of this community that and adding it to a member of this other community. But within a month, there was a fairly meaty project that had come up where problem was solved, right? Meaning that there was enough connection, there was bonding that had happened, and enough digging into, what could be a good solution. And that's one example that's happened. Another one is just I get outreached to a lot by mentees who are new to Canada, whether they share my background, which is Iranian Canadian. There's a lot of Iranian Canadians that are in Canada today getting settled in their careers, or other immigrants who reach out and they, request support. Often in those cases, it's a stress response where I go, how am I ever going to be able to solve this challenge? Every single time, it's the same feeling where I feel humbled by the fact that I don't have answers. I don't have enough reach to be able to solve this directly. But through networks, through just thinking about, okay, who are the kind helpers in my network who I also just want to stay in touch with, right? Like I want to be able to have more contacts in common with them. I want to be able to stay authentically involved in knowing where they're at. And that email that I put out to ask for help usually has me giving an update, the other person giving an update. Sometimes we go for a coffee, sometimes it's a Zoom connect, or just feedback on the individual that reached out and brainstorming, right? So it creates a mini team around the problem that we're trying to solve. And that feels fantastic. And it's usually a great reason to pause and give time because it takes the grind out of work, right? It puts more of a human element on what we do. And I think we're all seeking that these days, especially as we work mostly remote.
Oh, yeah. I definitely find I look forward to the virtual connections I have when it's like a coffee chat and I know we're, with people in my network that I've never met face to face. Many of them live in different countries. But when I know I'm having that coffee chat with them for that touch base, for that catch up, I look forward to it because I'm craving that social connection, right? I think since the pandemic, we all appreciate that face to face, the bonding that happens when you converse one to one versus over email, over text, and just being able to have the ability to see people as well. So that resonates very deeply with me. I love that. I love that whole trajectory that you shared. So you talked about this power of three. We know the effects. I mean, I've lived it because you're here, you're talking to me. You said yes, like without hesitation to this, which shocked me because I'm like, I know she's busy. I don't know. I don't expect you to have time. And you made the time. And I appreciate you for that. And, the ripple effects of that. So, from a leadership standpoint, what advice would you give to other leaders and how they can intentionally practice this power of three approach to help their teams and emerging leaders grow and even people in their network?
I think there's a series of steps and different degrees that you can exercise this concept on the power of three. One of the things that I like to do every once in a while is to sit down and make an inventory. It sounds funny, but to make an inventory of the people in my network who I think are problem solvers. And they're varied. They are usually top performers. They're people that I'm excited to stay in touch with. They're people that I've often not seen as much of as I'd like, but I make a list. Just seeing that list on a piece of paper or on, whether it's a digital tool, that gives me a sense of, okay, if this is my network, right? It reminds me of who's there, who's available to have connections with. Sometimes it prompts me to say, oh, I really haven't seen person X or Y. And there is value in me reconnecting with them for a current problem that I'm trying to solve. More importantly, it helps me take my head up one level from the technical work that I'm doing. And I think that's really, really important because relationships are one of the most important indicators of success. And that's true at every stage of life. There's research that has come out that says children who are deemed to be popular are the ones that actually have the most, they themselves like the most people. And so this is there since humans are born and they develop. And it certainly pays off. If you just think about the most successful folks in any field, they are the ones that have had access to knowledge through networks. They've had access to influence through networks. They've been able to sell their ideas through a network. And so that is really, really critical. Thinking about how are you taking stock of your relationship capital? Where is your relationship capital? Do you have enough of it? What are you missing? So I think taking stock of it is really, really important in any way that you can do it, whether it's digitally or even just in its most basic form, picturing it on a piece of paper. And often we'll find the folks that are stuck, a lot of the reasons they're stuck is they either don't have the network to problem solve with, they have not built that network to problem solve with, or they have hesitated in reaching out to their network. They've seen themselves as the sole owner of the problem that sits in front of them. Like people who are stuck in their careers are often sitting there either feeling sorry for themselves or feeling victimized by forces all around them without thinking about, wait, how do I solve this? Not just by myself, but with the power of three, let's say, three other folks that are invested in ideation, they're invested in giving advice, invested in giving of their networks. And so the multiplier effect of putting us out there more. So that's important. The second thing is just making time, I think, for relationship building. And if for those who are in roles that are more sales and marketing oriented in particular, they natively understand this. But I think we need to take it one step further and think about what are the efficient ways that we move those relationships forward in an authentic way. And also what you know what can we do to prioritize what the most important relationship nodes are for us, and that is being strategic with relationship building, because even human connection, when it is strategic, it can pay off more for us in terms of amplifying the reach for our brand, getting us more influence. So those two things are really, really important. And I think they require putting aside a little bit of mental buffer that isn't just about the immediate problem that we're trying to solve right in front of us. And that tiny bit of mental buffer can actually elevate us to solve problems in much deeper ways than we could all on our own.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I love that change in thought process, really, right? Because we are not alone, and no one that has reached a high level of success has done it alone. I'm also aware from like both from a gendered perspective, but also a cultural perspective of the way that I was raised was don't be loud, don't impose on people. So even just my very presence felt like an imposition. And so coming into the corporate world, and this here we are 30 years later, and it took me a good 15 years to get to that point of really understanding that reaching out to people and asking for that help or, asking for a connection, it's not an imposition, it's more of a gift because it enables that person to do something in return that helps them feel like they're more connected, or demonstrate a leadership opportunity. But there are still moments, even when I was building my program, that I struggled. I had that internal battle because that's deeply programmed and embedded. What advice would you have for women that are feeling that same way?
So I think this is actually really common with women. And you're right. I think it's definitely cultural for some of us, but it is also, I think, something that almost all cultures instill within women. Don't take up too much space. I think that's what it ultimately comes down to. For me, the way that I have overcome this earlier on in my career, it has been through thinking about this concept of servant leadership. And I've always approached the ask as very reciprocal. So I'm asking for something. What can I offer the other person to influence their connection with me, to want them in the boat with me for my success? And I think this is actually it's very fairly innate in folks that are in strategic sales roles because they think about what problem is the other person trying to solve, solution selling, and working with some really great sales leadership. I've started to realize this is actually powerful. Thinking about I'm taking a problem to someone, but they're solving problems that I don't know. So being curious to what is the other person's vantage point, whether you can devise that in advance of approaching them or even in the conversation, saying, I know you're busy, you are solving various challenges, anything that I can help with. Is there anything that my network can give you? And as you get older in the years and you have more of a network behind you, other problem solvers is another reason to keep building your network, right? This amplifying effect of the more people you have in your network to solve problems, the more problems you can help others solve. Right? And that sets, I think, folks apart from a leadership perspective if they understand that earlier on. When we start our careers, we're just starting to build our networks and thinking about good hygiene around that. Who do you keep in touch with? How often do you keep in touch? What do you do in order to keep in touch? What do you bring to your network as gifts that makes them want to keep in touch? So I think that is really, really important to think through and be intentional about.
Yeah, absolutely. It does help when you know that you are in turn making those proactive movements to offer up support in different ways so that when it comes time to where you need to ask for that support in kind, it doesn't feel as much of an intrusion or imposition.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and I think with time, I think this is the other thing. As we build up bigger networks and we have other problem solvers that we can reach out to, we become far more powerful. And I think this is something that women need to understand that we are actually very good. We assume it's so hard to get out there and to have a network. We're actually really good connectors naturally. And most of us who are worried about taking up too much space, if you look at our personal lives, there's a lot that we're doing that involves human connection, right? And so if we think about our gender as not a barrier to success, but there's superpowers that are developed earlier on in our lives, and we think about, how can I apply this superpower to solve these challenges differently. I think that's been one of the differentiators because for me, I've always understood, for example, both gender and my background as an Iranian Canadian, an immigrant, someone who's lived through war, that there is power in there too, because there's resilience, there is different types of problem solving, and there's cultural capital that comes with how problems are solved in different settings. So, in my more recent years, I've started to think about all of that as, oh, those are actually gifts that others may not have. So, those instead of thinking about them as impediments, I've thought about, what does that give me that should bring me additional confidence in order to present myself? And all of us have those qualities and those differentiators. We just have to think through that and think about that as a brand amplifier, and to start thinking about those things not as impediments. They can actually be huge assets in our careers.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a powerful shift to think about it that way. And I want to shift gears a little bit here. So, as women or anyone in the professional world, as they're growing their network, right, then it becomes a matter of how do I become more discerning around who to help
Yeah,
or who to attach my reputation to, because your reputation is currency at the top. So, what would that vetting process look like when you're putting your own reputation on the line to connect people?
sure. So I'll say this. I think the way that I've approached this, I'm a fairly open person. So I realized earlier on I don't really have a filter for who I decide to help. I think for me, earlier on, I actually decided, and this comes a little bit from having had immigrant parents, right? Because I saw that they had very little access to networks and how much even just one interaction can change lives. And so I remember being a fairly young kid in my early teens thinking, oh, if I ever get to a place where I can help people who don't have networks, I want to do that. Like I want to be there and be the person who says yes when doors are being slammed in people's faces or implicit bias exists in those settings. So that was a personal commitment that I made to myself earlier on. And then what happened is I got to the stage where I realized, oh, wow, scaling this is kind of hard, right? Because you can't say yes to every single outreach that happens. And so I went back to my toolbox and I thought about how can I help the most people? And again, thinking about it not through me, like how do I solve this all on my own? I started to create, and I think this is such a great tool. I started to create these communities, right? Where I said, there's only one of me. There's four people asking me the same question. And I don't have the ability to spend hours with every single person because then I wouldn't have the ability to do to have a career, right? And so I started curating these communities. So where I could, I would get together groups of people who I thought I could support. Then what happened from that thought is you start, and this was unintended, but what a great thing to learn. You start to see the confidence building mechanism that builds when people can compare their perspectives to one another, when they feel like they have community that they didn't have before, when they are giving each other advice. And so, what went from being a mentor mentee relationship, it actually became a mentoring circle. And I will say, every time I've done this, I've taken away just as much, if not more, from starting these communities than I ever assumed going into it. Because you go in thinking, oh, I'm gonna create all this value. And then you realize, oh wow, there's so much perspective that others bring you to look at the world in different ways. And especially as leaders, C-level leaders, having that perspective, people from different backgrounds, whether it's their, childhood backgrounds, whether it's cultural backgrounds, whether it's functional backgrounds, when you get that effect of being able to access people who to think differently, it makes you a very different type of leader at work. It makes you so much less one dimensional. It makes you much more relatable. It allows you to have a lot more to draw upon when you're storytelling or when you're trying to understand why does somebody else not think the way that I do. And all of those things lead up to having more presence for ourselves, right? So as I think about it, like having presence, I've spoken at various events and there's younger immigrants who'll come up to me and say, okay, how did you do that? I could never do that. And then you think, well, it was all tiny steps, right? It was tiny steps in building up your confidence and understanding that you have value in the world, taking up space, tiny tiny, tiny steps in taking up space, more and more space. And that space is easy to take up when you know that you're delivering value to others, right? So using that virtuous cycle, both for supporting others who have something to gain from what you have to give, but also using that to understand that we have value in the world. And I think especially for women, that is very important because sometimes getting to those moments of recognizing yourself and your voice doesn't come in those bursty, okay, get out on a corporate stage and just wow people. It doesn't happen like that. And we have less of those opportunities. It's earlier on. But if you think about being intentional about building that up, I think it's a virtuous cycle. You're helping others, you're helping yourself. When people come to ask for help, but they have unprocessed trauma. And by that, I mean, there's work things that have happened. There's a lot that has materialized, and it is trauma. And there is real tragedy in some of the ways that things have played out, but they have not spent the time to unstuck themselves from that before coming to you. And so when you are an executive who's trying to run these types of circles, at best, that's the time you have. You don't want to give that unprocessed trauma to whether it's your three that you're going to get because you're still asking for favors for people to step in, or even just other mentees. You don't want to bring that energy and throw it at others. I think there is self accountability around dealing with our trauma, and I say this as somebody who's grown up in wartime. So that's one. Second one is lack of accountability. So, when we go through work settings, how we talk about coming in and out of work settings, whether it's even layoffs, right? Or work settings that we're not excited to have been a part of. Anyone who has self accountability takes the time to process what's happened. Yes, there are things that were out of our control that were not fun to deal with, but what could we have done differently? What would we do differently? I think that is often evident in how people talk about why they want your help. And so hearing accountability is really, really important. And it ties back to a little bit to unprocessed trauma, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a third one, and this one is a little bit of like, I'll call it market delusion, where the individual is asking for something that the labor market's not going to support. And they haven't done the work of identifying, okay, there's a ladder between this and this, or understanding where that gap is. They're just determined that the market is wrong and they're right. And therefore, it's just a matter of finding the right person to talk to and being given those opportunities. So those are my three. But again, I would say 90+% of the time, I'm a yes. And I make time by building communities, not having to think through one-on-one help. Doesn't mean one-on-ones don't happen. It's just they're a little bit more organic in those communities.
Yeah, and that's a great way to scale because it's impossible to address every single request the bigger your network grows. So I love having that. It feels like a framework of how to identify when a person's even ready for that help. So another thing, being a woman in corporate and 30 years of this, definitely I have lived this and seen this. Corporate politics often punishes women for being too ambitious. So, how do you use this framework to build a web of influence with stakeholders so that you become more visible and without the backlash?
Yeah. So I think this one's an interesting theme. So I've had some lessons along the way that are interesting to think through at this phase of my career, because at this phase I'm now looking at others trying to break through and identifying, oh, this is what differentiated me or others, and hoping that we can spread the message a little bit wider. I think a few themes to bring to you. So, one is this concept of abundance versus scarcity, right? I think often what happens, especially with us women, is because we are underrepresented in, top higher up positions. There's this message inherently that, oh, there's a limited number of spots for women that forms in our heads. And so we start to move towards this concept of scarcity, right? We think about the limited spots, we compete more than we collaborate, and we start to psych ourselves out with this concept of there's only so many spots, there's only so many spots. And so the way that I've overcome that part of the psyche, and that is real, it's all in our heads, but it is real, the fear that we have. I think the way that I've worked around that is to move beyond this concept that, oh, I must stay in this exact organization in order to reach whatever limited number of spots that are available. Instead, I focused on the core skills. And so what do I need to develop in order to credibly speak to my work experience, whether in this setting, if I'm in an internal interview, or in an external setting, because I could get to a place where the organization values me, but they don't have the space to move me up or the capacity, the number of open roles. And so I've depersonalized that, right? I'm going to go get the skills. I'm going to map the skills that I need. I'm going to get the mentorship on like what those skills are, make sure that I'm not missing anything and just go after that. And so focus on that versus the goal, which is the promotion, the title, the pay, right? And I've given myself time periods. Like within the next year, I'd like to develop these skills. And I've gone and done those things without expecting an immediate return, but knowing that within this time frame, if the opportunities don't present themselves, I will be having conversations externally. And I think a lot of the folks that are quite stuck in their careers, they are thinking of the box as much more limited. I have to do this in this exact organization. It has to happen. This is the exact job. And I've done it too, by the way. I've been at that phase of my career where I thought, if I don't hit this exact point, it'll be the end of the world, right? And this exact job title. And that I think is a very limited mentality, right? And so if you focus on the skills and you get the confidence to speak about your skill set, you're marketable, whether internally or externally. So that's one. The second one is on servant leadership versus visibility. If you just think about even in the most toxic organizations, people notice who is trying to help others. And if you don't tie servant leadership to bizarre levels of loyalty to the organization that you're at who doesn't offer you growth, servant leadership can actually be, again, another tool for building loyalty across the organization to you as a brand, but also building your confidence to say, okay, like I have served this organization. I have the confidence to know that I've served this organization and at this level and I've built these skills. Therefore, if there's no opportunity internally, I will go. That is important. Even in the most toxic organizations, servant leaders are noted. And then the last one is, we touched on it for the first two, is just this concept of exit confidence, right? Have the ability to know what you want to get out of a year or two in a role and understand what you want to exude at the end of that 1 or 2 years. Work on that when you have time. Don't get yourself worked up about, you know, things, all the ducks having to line up internally. The folks that are the most confident and they move up faster, they understand their value and they don't they don't hold it over others' heads, right? Like they're not do this or else. They're just pragmatic, and I think that keeps perspective at a different level. It reduces politics even when there's toxicity all around us. Again, gives us resilience in the way that we go about solving the real problems, not the politics in an organization.
Yeah. For sure. And politics, definitely that's an interesting aspect because women really cringe at the politics piece. But there's a way that we can identify what's happening and also how to work within that. But it's so true. Beyond the title, it's really how are you going to show up better every day for the team? How are you going to contribute value? And, what are the skills that you want to grow? I love that. We are at the end of time, so I'll wrap it up with this final question I love asking my guests. The old corporate playbook is something that focused on protecting relationships, controlling access. What is the most dangerous old school rule about this professional gatekeeping that women need to stop following immediately if they want to actually scale their impact?
So I'll take us back to where we started, which is the power of three. And I think it's this concept of winning in a silo. I think the old corporate playbook was much more ego driven. It was much more about the person rather than their influence or their reach, which is much more than the person itself. I think this concept of gatekeeping, keeping the great opportunities for yourself, not celebrating other successes, all of that, I think is something we should ditch. We should openly celebrate not just women, but men as well. Like we should openly celebrate top performers. We should learn from them. We should want to be associated with them. We should increase our influence through that network internally and externally. And, what do you replace it with? There's this concept of radical generosity that can make a big difference. And we've talked about it with examples. The power of three is actually quite rooted in that concept of radical generosity, finding time to continue to support others and build your network. I think that's what can replace the gatekeeping behavior, the siloed wins that maybe previously in old economy were the source of some successes. I don't think that works anymore. And so if you just think about influence is amplified when we have a deeper network. And our networks are an asset that we're building throughout all of our careers. And those of us who are going to be more successful have bigger networks, and networks benefit from doing good. They're much stickier in quality when we're all doing good together. And so it does become a virtuous cycle.
Brilliant. That is such a lovely way to wrap up. You've shared so many wonderful insights today, Sai. Thank you so much for your time and for being here with me today to talk about this.
Thank you for having me.
This has been such a rich conversation. And for those of you that are listening, I hope you walked away with at least one thing that you're going to do differently this week. The power of three, radical generosity, abundance over scarcity, and the confidence to leave a situation that is no longer serving you. These aren't just concepts, they're a completely different way of thinking about how we show up, how we build, and how we grow in our careers and for the people around us. What stays with me most from this conversation is this: the leaders who get furthest are not the ones hoarding opportunities or solving everything alone. They're the ones who understand that their network is an asset, that helping others is a strategy, and that influence compounds when it's built on generosity. If you're a woman in leadership who has been playing small, waiting to be noticed, or carrying the weight of your career entirely on your own shoulders, today's episode was for you. If you want to learn more about Sai and her work at Introhive, you can connect with her on LinkedIn or visit introhive.com. All the links will be in the show notes. If this episode resonated with you, here's your Power of Three moment. Share it with someone in your network who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me what stuck with you. And if you can, take a minute to rate the podcast. Every share, every comment, every rating helps the show reach more women who are ready to lead differently. That right there is your first act of radical generosity. Thank you for listening to Leadership Recalibrated, a leadership insight series from Her Executive Ascent. I'll see you in the next episode. The leadership advice that got many women this far will not necessarily get them where they want to go next. This phase of your career is not about working harder. It's about working strategically by deciding which rules still apply and which ones you are finally ready to outgrow. If this conversation resonated, stay with us, subscribe to the podcast, and join me here every Sunday for new episodes. And if it gave you language for something you've been carrying quietly, share it with another woman in your network who needs to hear it too. Until next time, lead with intention, question everything, and change the rules for the better. I'm Lori Lalonde, and this is Leadership Recalibrated.